Hey folks, welcome to the channel. This video is going to be two videos in one. The bulk of the video, as the thumbnail suggests, is going to be the state of Warlock, where we discuss the three specs and my thoughts and feelings going into Dragonflight, strengths, weaknesses and stuff like that, while also at the same time saying thank you to everyone because we have finally made it past the 1k milestone. So we're currently going through the process that entails, and I really wanted to say thank you. So this video is a double up of that, but let's get into the main reason you guys have clicked, and let's discuss Warlocks both in Prepatch and in Dragonflight. And with the thank you banner rolling, let's get into the specs. So starting with Affliction, left-hand side of the screen. Affliction's pre-patch state compared to its early Dragonflight state on the beta is, for want of a better term, described as powerful but stable. Affliction very much has the choice between its AoE damage and its single target damage, during the pre-patch at least. Come Dragonflight itself, when we have access to those final 5 points, we have a little bit more options in terms of being able to hybridize or being able to fully sync into one way or the other. A good example of this is either do you want to utilize Haunt and its ability to increase the damage of all your dots by 20%, as well as using your Dark Lair Grim Reach for those large AoE moments, or do you want to go like Wrath of Consumption along with Decaying Soul Satchel for those really big sinks of AoE every minute, 2 minutes, with both Soul Rots and Dark Lair being essentially interchangeable, giving you that Mythic Plus profile of 1 minute, 2 minute burst, much like the old Red Paladin that I used to play. Alternatively, you can sync into pure single target or more single target focused using Dread Touch along with Haunt and further augmenting all your dot damage. You'll do, 40% extra damage to your main target because it'll have both Haunt on it and Dread Touch. Dread Touch doing the exact same thing as Haunt's capstone of increasing dot damage by 20%, but obviously only on that single target, which will be really nice if you have priority targets that you need to take down, but thanks to Haunt's effect, you'll still be able to do a reasonable amount of passive AoE, which is pretty nice, and puts us in a really stable position. Obviously, tuning and numbers are still yet to be decided, especially for beta itself, going into the expansion main next month. But for now, at least, Affliction's in a really, really good spot. It's kind of taken a bit of a hit in the last week due to the bug fix that was Necrolord Affliction, with Shard of Annihilation and Decimating Bolt actually buffing multiple drained souls when it shouldn't have been. That fix has kind of neutered single target Affliction slightly. Some key warlocks in the community were streaming and kind of showing off just how busted Necrolord Affliction could be, but that has kind of been brought back down to where it should have been, which is still to say fairly strong, but it's not, ticking out 95k drained souls for the fun of it multiple times, which is good in my opinion. And I'm going to explain why it's good, because this goes for all three specs. We're not as busted as some other classes in that regard of just how much damage these can do. And the reason that's good, there is an exception for destruction. Yes, I know, we'll discuss Burn to Ashes, Necrolord when we get there. But the reason it's good is it means that when we go into Dragonflight, we can only get stronger. We don't want to be in a position where, for the pre-patch, due to the synchronization of multiple Covenant abilities or multiple legendary effects and things like that, being able to burst for obscene amounts of damage, only for those obscene amounts of damage to then be drastically neutered when it comes to Dragonflight itself, because we no longer have access to that. And it's a really steep thing to learn, especially when you consider that for some specs, especially when you take the information from pre-patch through to beta, they're actually doing less damage in the beta than they are now. At 70 with gear, and bearing in mind that the average gear level of going into dungeons and things like that, you're sitting at about 390, if not higher, especially when you take into the normal tier sets and being able to like buy 4 or 3 PvP gear and stuff like that. They're still doing less damage than they are now. And that's a really horrible place to sit as a spec, or even as a class, but Warlocks don't really have that problem. Affliction, specifically, due to the way it works, and where our damage comes from, especially in AoE settings, for those of you that have watched my YouTube short of Affliction hitting 224k AoE burst, where I pretty much delete a pack. It was a very, very large pack, I will admit, but because our damage comes from abilities like Soul Flame or dot damage, once we get everything out, it's out. And if something dies, it detonates like back in Legion, doing AoE damage to everything around it. Now, that is irrespective of what conduits, covenants, or anything else we're running, which means that come beta, we're only going to get stronger, because everything syncs up better, and we're actually going to have a tier set that works, which is going to be nice. Demonology, moving on to that spec now, is in a somewhat similar boat. Whereas Affliction is very much AoE or single target focused, Demonology is kind of in the same boat as far as it isn't quite finished yet, and you have to make certain choices in terms of the pre-patch, which, you know, is fine. Everyone's got to make these choices, but for Demonology it's a little bit more profound in that you really have to decide what you want, especially if you want the spec to play a certain way. Like, because we don't have those 5 final talents, we're unable to essentially have our cake and eat it. At the moment, or throughout the entirety of Shadowlands, due to the way that spell ranks worked, we were used to our Tyrant generating us shards when we cast it. However, you now obviously have to talent into that, and it's a 2-point talent. Which means that if you still want your Tyrant to be generating you shards, you need to be sinking 2 points into that, which takes away from your ability to get other things, whether you want to be playing with Nether Portal Capstone traits, or if you want to be going down Feltauran armaments and getting the ability to throw your axe and have your pulsating weapon for your Felguard, which that bug and interaction between that and Demonic Strength has been fixed. So while one is active, you can't use the other one, which is nice, as that kind of saves on the spell queuing thing and the problems that we had with that ability. But, as I say, because we don't necessarily have that, and there are certain builds where you kind of have to play around either making sure that you have more demonic cores to be able to use your demon bolts more frequently to try and combat the lack of shards, or you play kind of Reign of Tyranny / Wilfrids, but as a result you're kind of not getting the full benefit when it comes to AoE or kind of your cleave damage, which kind of sucks, but it sucks now and only improves going into the Dragonflight expansion itself as things improve. So if you're really loving Demonology as things are, even though the damage might not necessarily be there because of Demonology's profile for more single target and into cleave, so small target count cleave moments, or burst, I'll get onto that in a second now, Demonology only improves. It gets better. And it's kind of that slow and steady power progression that you'll feel as Demonology is. You get more gear as you level, as you get a couple more talents, you're going to just keep feeling stronger and stronger and more comfortable as well. Because Demonology has quite a bit to juggle with certain builds, and I'll discuss it when I discuss the Tazavesh Streets key that you're watching as the Demonology segment of this video. We'll discuss just how much there is to juggle in that video and kind of the learning curve that that entails. But once you get it done, you're going to have an answer for just about everything, as long as it's not sustained answers that you need. And the reason for this is because of the toolkit that Demonology has. Demonology can do some amazing burst damage to large packs through Dogs, Dreadlash, your Felguard's cleaving abilities, Felsunder, Implosion. You can have that. The problem is the nature of it is very bursty. Like, you will have these elements of, okay, we've just pulled 10 mobs, I have 9 imps ready to go. You Felstorm or Demonic Strength, stack a buff up, you then use your Core Dreadstalkers, which then Dreadlash everything, and then you implode. That is a huge amount of burst AoE damage. The problem is, once that huge amount of damage is done, you now need to build up. Like, your dogs are going to cleave a little bit, your Felguard's going to cleave a little bit, if everything's stacked. But you then need to obviously make sure that you cast your Hand of Guldans, you need your imps back, you then go through your cycle, and then you implode again for another burst of damage. So you're going to have these small little peaks every 10, 15 seconds throughout the course of a pack duration, which is going to potentially feel a little bit jarring depending on pull cadence. Now, if you have huge pack pulls as Demonology, you're not really going to be able to compete with the likes of Affliction or Destruction. But at the same time, if you have a tank that's learning, or you're learning the dungeon yourself, Demonology has enough of a toolkit and enough cooldowns with the builds that you can kind of rotate anything and everything. So you've got like minute cooldown on Demonic Strength. Your dogs are always going to cleave. You've got your Hand of Gul'dan. You've got your Implosion. So you've got an answer for stacked mobs at any point. You just need them off cooldown, or you need 6 to 9 imps in order to do your Implosion rotation. But then you've also got 2-minute Grimmer Felguard. You've got 1.5 minute Tyrant if you're not reducing that cooldown. You've got 45 seconds on Axe Toss, or the AoE Guillotine. The name escapes me at the moment, I do apologise. But if you go down, and we discussed the spell in the Demonology build video anyway, but you can kind of see that you have a lot of different little cooldowns that you can use, and there will come points in the dungeon where you can stack them together to do stupid things, or stupid amounts of burst damage. But they are going to be short-lived bursts of damage, and going into Dragonflight itself, its main expansion, then you're kind of going to see the same thing. It's going to be a really, really good single target and small pack encounter. So if you're like pushing certain keys, or you have a slightly slower tank, Demonology is going to put you in a good stead, especially if you're learning the dungeon yourself. Because as I said, Demonology kind of has something for everything. It just might not be as good at the moment. The flip side of this, though, and this is something that you need to bear in mind, is how Demonology scales. We don't have demonic consumption anymore, so we don't scale off stamina as much as we used to. However, Demonology is one of those sleeper agents at the moment. And this is kind of where we get into my personal opinion, my feely crafty, and my kind of knowledge of how things have panned out over previous years. Demonology, out of the 3 specs, is probably going to be the one that is the most stable for everything. Like, if you want to dabble in everything, Demo's going to do you. But Demo's also going to get stronger as the tier progresses. So I suspect, come about January time, bearing in mind that's only going to be, 4-5 weeks into the new tier, Demonology is going to have its place on certain fights. And it's going to dominate in those certain fights or those certain dungeons because of how reliable Demonology can be. Because that's the thing, Demonology is the reliable spec. It's, good old faithful. Whereas moving into Destruction's not old faithful. Not anymore. Destruction is the jack of all trades spec for Warlock, and this is because of the flexibility of the spec tree itself that we've discussed previously. Now, because of its flexibility, it's also probably got the steepest learning curve in terms of dungeon, and even in raid encounters, because what you're going to be looking at is a situation where if you pick the wrong talent build, or you don't quite know how best to maximize your talent build for a fight, you're going to end up in a position where, unfortunately, you're going to get caught sleeping. Because you're not necessarily going to have the answer to something like Demonology just passively does within its toolkit. But if you do know the fight, and you know what's coming, or you have a certain playstyle that you excel at, say, at the moment in the pre-patch, Necrolord Burn to Ashes, really strong performer, but it kind of changes the way you play slightly, because it's less about having these moments of glory, for want of a better term, where you have these huge, insane moments. Yes, Decimating Bolt incinerates does do a lot of damage in the pre-patch, and you can have your haha, I've just crit for, 150k for an incinerate. Or in this junkyard key, I managed a 240k crit on the final boss with an incinerate. 250,000. To put that into perspective, the only other time I've come close to doing stupid numbers like that is either Soulflame for Affliction Warlock detonating the pack at the start of the Gambit, where I did something like 2 million damage in a global because of Soulflame, or, which, to be fair, doesn't really count because that's more of just everything dying because it was low health anyway. But actual spellcast would probably be in Torghast, where you have all the stupid ramping abilities, and I ended up with a 3.5 million Tyrant. To be fair, it was about 5 Tyrants all casting at the same time, but it still counted as a 3.5 million Tyrant cast. Destruction, very much, especially with Burn to Ashes, has the ability to just consistently pump out AoE damage. Because for those of you that don't know, the Burn to Ashes talent, when you cast Rain of Fire or Chaos Bolt, you buff the next 2 casts of your Incinerate. This buff stacks so you can get multiple casts, multiple Shard Spender casts out, and then burn all your Incinerates afterwards. Which, when you consider that you've got things like Fire and Brimstone, you've got Pyrogenics, and being able to increase the fire damage that things take while they're stood within your Rain of Fire, you have Roaring Blaze, you can really augment the amount of damage that you do with those Incinerates, even without Decimating Bolt and Shard of Annihilation. Granted, the crits aren't going to be anywhere near as high, but still, pair that with the fact that you can also have Diabolic Embers, which increases the shard generation that your Incinerates do. You can quite literally just pump out consistent fire damage with Incinerates, Rain of Fires, and Blasphemy Infernals as well. Now pair that with Madness of the Ashakia, and maybe add your Infernal to the mix for a 3-minute cooldown. You have this situation where, in a Mythic Plus dungeon, as a Warlock, running Burn to Ashes, you literally just have an answer for any pack that comes. Like, you don't care if you have a cooldown or not, because you're going to have at least 1 or 2 Blasphemy Infernals in that pack. Which, they just pulsate AoE damage, and it's, Bob's your uncle, Happy Larry, let's go, I don't care. Tank can pull what he likes, as long as he pulls packs rather than single mobs. Alternatively, if you're playing with a tank that you're not sure about, or a tank that doesn't pull as large as you'd like, say you're running with a guild tank or you're running with a friend that tanks, and they're learning the dungeon, they don't know what to pull, so they're pulling conservatively. You can instead run a build where Chaos Bolt is your AoE spender, because you either have Havoc as a normal ability, and you can obviously cleave Havoc, we all know how that works, but then you've got things like Cry Havoc, where if your Chaos Bolt is duplicated by Havoc, it will detonate and hit multiple targets, everything within 8 yards, for an amount of damage. But if that's the case and you go Mayhem rather than Havoc, your single target spells have a chance to just randomly apply Havoc. And as we demonstrated in the Destruction guide for the pre-patch, you can have multiple applications of Havoc rapidly after one another. And if you're using Chaos Bolt as your only shard spender rather than Rain of Fire, everything you cast is going to be single target, basically. Outside of maybe having Fire and Brimstone, which, you know, alright. But then you'll have, you know, your Infernal, maybe Diabolic Embers if you want to for the shards, with Madness of the Ashikir, and maybe Dimensional Rift. Or, once we get into beta, not beta, Dragonflight itself, you can also have your Blasphemy Infernals as well. So you're going to be spending all these shards on these Chaos Bolts, with Infernal, Crashing Chaos, Reign of Chaos, and your Blasphemy Infernals, that you just end up in a situation where you're still doing AoE damage, but it's all a single target rotation. So whether your tank is pulling 1 mob, 2 mob, 4 mob, 5 mobs, it don't really matter. You're still going to be able... You're essentially just going to be playing like everything's a single target game. And the more targets that are put into the fight, yes, you'll have some diminishing damage from it. Like, you won't compete with the Burn to Ashes, constant AoE pumping Rain of Fire build, but you're still going to be able to do a considerable amount of damage, which is huge. And that flexibility is immense, because it means that regardless of your spec, but especially if you love Destruction, you can play it and it's going to be viable. And I dare say it's also going to be kind of in that A tier-ish area for those of you that are really, you know, I need this classified as a tier. Because then if we are going to classify everything as belonging in a tier, we end up in a situation where I suspect, in the pre-patch at least, Warlock probably sits mid A tier with possibly Destruction and or Affliction sitting a little bit higher in the A bracket, maybe even touching the S bracket, as things currently stand. Going into the expansion release itself and going into Dragonflight Season 1, we're going to end up in a situation where, again, we're going to probably start straddling B tier, with Affliction and Destruction kind of sitting in the bottom end of A tier, with Demonology in the B tier. But this is primarily due to the fact that, at least as things stand in the beta with tuning and things, remember, these tier brackets will change as tuning changes. The beta at the moment through all testing is very melee dominated. Warriors, Feral Druids, Assassination Rogues, Demon Hunters, things like that. They do a considerable amount of damage early doors, which kind of puts casters on the back foot a little bit, but we're also strong enough that in the right hands, we can massively outstrip these other classes. Like, I've done keys where I have outstripped Demon Hunters, I have outstripped Feral Druids, and been able to hold my own in huge packs, huge dungeons, and been able to kind of hold my own in single target. But yeah, so in summary, Destruction Warlocks are strong, massively. So we bring a huge amount of utility, but also our damage is really respectable and promising as well, which is always good and is always a nice thing to hear. But things only go up from where we are currently, and things will improve because we're not as hampered as much by the borrowed power systems of Shadowlands as some of our other competitors within the game. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed the video, and again, thank you very much for everyone that subscribed to the channel. It means a lot that we've managed to hit 1,000 subs this year before Christmas, and if you haven't subbed and you've liked the video, please do feel free to join the community. It'd be great to speak, and see you all next time. Catch you later, folks.